When I was a general counsel, I always had a 90-day plan for every team member that brought on. And then at least half of that plan would be a list of names. And I would tell them the most important thing in your first 90 days is to go find these people and build a relationship with them. Get on their calendar, set up 30 minutes, go to a function, however you do it. But I'm going to be asking you at the end of the 30 day or 90 days, like, do you know these people? Because I would pick out folks that I knew would be make or break for the team members.
If you're in the C-suite, what do you really need to know about ESG? Is ESG the new privacy? And should ESG really be so controversial? Today, we are joined on the abstract by my friend, Christine Uri, founder of ESG for In-house Counsel. She helps In-house Counsel launch ESG initiatives that meet client, investor, and regulatory expectations. Before starting her own consultancy, she was the chief legal officer and the chief sustainability officer at NG Impact, which she joined via a merger. She actually joined that company via an acquisition. So she basically spent like 10 plus years working for businesses that deliver sustainability solutions and services to corporations, cities, and governments around the globe. So she knows a lot about ESG from a lot of different angles. And a fun fact, she is a longtime resident of the Pacific Northwest, but she clerked for a federal judge in West Virginia early in her legal career. Christine, thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was just thrilled to hear that this is something that you're interested in and SpotDraft is interested in, and you think your audience would want to learn more about.
Absolutely. I think a lot of folks listening in who are GCs, members of in-house teams, legal ops professionals are going to be super interested to learn about ESG today. But let's start like easy and soft, which is before you launched your business at the start of the year, you took a lot of last fall off. What did you do with that time?
Yeah. Great question. I actually keep this noted on my LinkedIn profile because I want people to know that I took time off. I had been in 10 years in a law firm and then 10 years at a corporate job without really any break at the time that I left NG Impact. And I just thought, when am I going to get a chance to really take a breather again in my career? Probably, you just don't run across that very often. So luckily I'd been around long enough to take advantage of it. It helped that my job, I ended my job right going into summer. So that it's July and August. If you know anything about the Pacific Northwest, that is the time to be here. And I'm like, I'm not going to work. That's it. So I took the summer. I played a ton of pickleball. I spent time in the yard with my dog, Scooter. In September, I was very fortunate. My brother was getting married in Italy, so I had an excuse to go to Italy for 2 weeks and play there. And then, October, November, I started just thinking about what I wanted to do next.
That sounds like a dream lifestyle, like pickleball, hanging out with your dog, going to Italy. I love that. And I really like that you leave it on your LinkedIn profile too. I mean, that probably comes from many years of being a member of the C-suite and wanting to signal to folks that it's okay to take some time away from work. Okay. Before you launched the consulting business, as I mentioned, you spent about 10 years working for companies that provided sustainability or provide sustainability solutions. What does that mean? Like, what does sustainability solutions mean? And then the fact that you were in the sustainability sector, how has that impacted your view or influenced your view of ESG?
Well, starting broadly, and sustainability is a word that really gets misunderstood quite a bit. So with sustainability, at its base is about processes, a process that can continue on its own without collapsing. Though it has a very broad meaning. For the company that I worked at, we really focused on climate and energy. And this is where you see sustainability, that word, being used very often these days. My theory of it is that climate is one of the least sustainable things that we have going on in the world. So if you're trying to focus on what's not sustainable, how we're approaching climate, that's got to be top of the list. So
Right.
the company I was at worked in energy, worked with Fortune 500 to help reduce their carbon footprint, reduce their energy usage. And for me, what that means is I spent 10 years just steeped in this environment that was all about climate and how corporations can solve for climate.
When you started working on ESG for NG or for the sort of companies that came before, did you have any idea that ESG was going to become such a big field, or that so many other folks who were in-house were going to want to work on this? Was that clear at that point in time?
No, I started in 2013 at In-house, and at that time, I wanted to work at a company that aligned with my values, but I had no environmental sustainability background. I had no ESG background. I wasn't really, I was more focused on a values alignment than an environmental mission. And in 2013, companies were pretty early in on what they were doing. So we had a corporate sustainability program. It was corporate social responsibility. That's what companies called it. And I was an advisor on that from the very beginning. And it was really treated in companies like something separate from the business. Like, oh, this is a nice thing we're doing on the side to give back with our employees, and we're planting some trees and making some charitable donations. Our everyday work was still around energy and helping clients use less energy. There's more of an economic motivation at first, although carbon was always a piece of it. And then what I saw, over the next decade was this huge change in how companies approached sustainability, and the term ESG kind of shifted out of a pure investment context into more of a company operations context, because investors were really wanting companies to improve their ESG practices. And then along that line, I saw companies really setting bolder goals in 2019, 2020. Many companies coming out with net zero targets or carbon neutral targets. And all of a sudden, this became a top 5 issue on corporate executives' plates. So, which is very different from where it was when I started in 2013.
You used a term there, and maybe it's good for us to be doing this early on. You said corporate social responsibility, CSR. We're also talking about ESG, like environmental and social governance. Where did those two terms come together? Are they different? Do they mean the same thing in a lot of contexts? Like, walk us through that.
Yeah, they are different things. And I can tell you experts can spend a lot of time arguing over what they mean. But fundamentally, corporate social responsibility is a term that was used more, early 2010s. And it was about corporations, being responsible citizens. And like I said, really kind of separate from their operations. So, maybe they do some philanthropy, or maybe they do some employee volunteering, something along those lines, but it wasn't really integrated into operations. And then, that term started to slip out, and sustainability came to be the term the term that was used. And when sustainability came in, it increased the environmental focus a lot. It increased the climate focus a lot. What happened was that companies were putting out sustainability reports and sharing sustainability data on a voluntary basis. But the data and reporting and statements, there wasn't confidence that they were accurate, and they weren't comparable. So investors started wanting to know that the data was accurate and wanting to make it comparable. So that's when you saw the term ESG come in, and investors pushed for, and regulators responded to, requests to have regulations and standards for these disclosure processes. So you're seeing that now, a shift from voluntary to mandatory. And then in the US, you have this whole, and as far as I can tell, it's US only, you have this whole other dynamic of anti-ESG backlash that's coming out of the political sphere. And in some cases, companies are kind of retreating to sustainability, but the two are really, I'd say, in my opinion, ESG is part of sustainability. And it's honestly, the part that we really want companies focusing on, because it's the part that's directly within the company's control, that's measurable, that they can make progress against, and that investors, clients, stakeholders can really uncover what is a company doing.
So there's a lot for us to unpack in that, I think, and we're gonna keep talking about it. I want to hear first, though, about why you decided to launch a consultancy. Like, why did you decide to step away from doing this full time for one company in-house and try to help others? Like, how did you know it was the right time to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if you, when is it the right time to start a business?
Totally.
I had, in 2020, I'd started publishing on LinkedIn, and I did it with this idea of seeing more and more in-house counsel taking on ESG or sustainability issues. And rarely did they have the kind of expertise and support that I had at NG to do that. And so there's a lot of struggling to get going, or I'd see general counsel who wanted to do something but just didn't have the confidence. So I started publishing on LinkedIn resources to encourage the in-house community to become more active, to help make them more effective in advocating for this in their companies, to provide practical solutions, practical steps that they could get their arms around and take and implement in their companies. So I've been doing that since 2020. And during that time, I just saw the need really grow as these regulations came into effect. And I was, after 10 years in a company, I had kind of reached as much as I was going to learn in the position I had there. And I just thought, okay, here's an opportunity to grow and expand and learn new things and help more companies.
And your content is fantastic, by the way. If folks don't follow you on LinkedIn, they absolutely should. They'll just start learning like a little bit about ESG week in, week out, from the graphics and, slideshows and et cetera, all the things that you publish. Why do you think ESG should matter to in-house counsel, to your clients? And I might also sort of ask a question that's encapsulated in that, which is it different if, let's say, you are a public company and so the SEC regs affect you as opposed to if you're a private company? Like, why should it matter to sort of those two populations of in-house lawyers?
So for private in-house lawyers, what I see all the time is that ESG is landing on their desks in some way. So most commonly I hear from a US context where often if you're a private company, you're not really subject to regulatory disclosure requirements currently around ESG. I hear about clients and how clients are asking for ESG data and ESG reporting. And that's been happening for years, but it was happening when I was a chief legal officer. But honestly, clients weren't super serious about it. Like you could find a way to kind of fudge around answering the questions if you didn't have good answers. That's not the case today. Clients really want answers, and they want good answers. And that's because of a couple different drivers. One is if you have large European clients or large global clients, they are becoming subject to regulatory requirements that require them to dive into their supply chain and get this data. So it's part of their compliance programs. And then a lot of the companies have set with a net zero goal. And if they've set a net zero goal related to their scope 3, these are, I know, terms of art within this world, but if they've set these targets, it means they are including their supply chain in what they consider their carbon footprint and committed to driving that down. So you're seeing, if you're a private company, you're in a B2B sector. We're talking, this is, very much B2B. These client requests often land on in-house counsel's plates. If you're private equity owned, a lot of the private equity players are also pushing for this kind of information. This can also land on in-house counsel's plate. Usually in-house counsel is also more aware of the regulatory environment, and you'll kind of If you're in Europe, you are just awash in regulations right now. I mean, you are buried in ESG regulations that you have to figure out how to comply with. If you're in the US or Canada, you're kind of watching this and you're wondering, okay, when is this going to impact me? What do I have to pay attention to? So it kind of becomes one of those things in the background of your worries. So all of these kind of contribute to why in-house counsel at private companies are getting involved in ESG. Public companies, things look a lot different. Usually they're larger. Usually, they'll have a separate sustainability team of some kind or some leadership level that is responsible for ESG or sustainability, whatever term you decide to use. And what the legal counsel really has to make sure that the company is disclosing accurately, that they are disclosing consistently, that you're more likely to be subject to some of these broader global regulations or financial reporting standards, that those are getting hit. So there is a real legal role that has to be played regardless of where ESG or sustainability sits within the organization.
You've coined a term, and I spent a good portion of my career working on privacy and data protection issues. So it really resonates with me, and also based on all the things that you've just said, right? Like vendors are demanding it, investors are concerned about it. You're thinking about diligence down the road. There may be regulation coming, even if it's not here yet. ESG is the new privacy. Tell us more about sort of how you came up with that, why you came up with that, why that you think is the right framing for in-house counsel potentially to be using around this.
Yeah. So the way I roll back to I was a U.S. general counsel in 2015, and we knew that GDPR was coming and it's going to be enforceable in Europe in 2018, and that this was down the road. And I started learning about it and what will be required. And my first reaction was, that's insane. That's an European problem. I don't want to deal with this. I had that initial pullback on privacy. And there was a moment in the US when, if you had a US only company, and later I grew over, leadership over 20 countries. So that changed the picture. But if you had a US only company, you would be looking for ways to ignore this because it just seemed tremendously inconvenient, and you didn't want to deal with it. But pretty soon what happened is it became very apparent that you could not ignore privacy and GDPR specifically, because now we operate in a global world. Most of the businesses that are big enough to have a GC will have global ambitions of some kind, will have some global clients. It's a much more borderless business operation. And if you are operating, so a couple things happen. If you're operating in multiple countries, it is very difficult to maintain different, privacy practices across the board, because you have too much data flowing in different directions. So it's much easier to just apply a conservative standard. So that's one. And then once you have those larger companies just applying GDPR in the marketplace, you see it become a competitive issue. And then you have, small startups that have to end up with this SOC 2 compliance, and it just becomes a standard for doing business that people expect. And so I saw that whole progression, and I see ESG in the same way in terms of the reporting. Now, what the actions you have to take are very different. And if you're complying with European CSRD regulations, they'll honestly be much heavier than GDPR. However, I think from a U.S. general counsel perspective, it's a helpful comparison, because it's a reminder of, okay, European regulation can expand out and impact U.S. businesses. So even if you are not directly subject to this regulation, companies do substantial business in Europe. They will be setting up these disclosures and being able to provide this information. They will be expecting it from their supply chain, and it is going to infiltrate and be something that you have to deal with regardless of whether the U.S. government ever has regulation related to these disclosures.
Hey there, legal teams. Big news. SpotDraft's fall release is here, and it's our biggest update yet. With over 15 new features, it's packed with tools to make contracting faster and simpler for you. Want complete control over your workflows? You've got it with customizable approvals that actually fit your processes. Looking for clarity? Use SpotDraft's new analytics offering to uncover insights and find ways for your legal team to move faster. We've also made it easier to manage your agreements with the new Legal Hub, a straightforward way to publish and update terms online without waiting on IT or marketing. And here's the game changer. Our AI tools, like Verify, take on the boring stuff, contract reviews, and metadata extraction, so your team can focus on making decisions that matter. It's everything you need to manage your contracts your way. Check it out at spotdraft.com/fall-release. That's spotdraft.com/fall-release. Now let's get back to the podcast. Let's say that you're the GC and you, for whatever reason, you are now the one sort of advocating for adopting ESG practices or reporting. Is that really the answer that you give your CEO or your CFO if one of those folks is pushing back? Like how have you dealt with the investment needed in these programs?
Never start with regulation. So that's regulation, very important to lawyers. I'm sorry, it's not important to any other, as important to any other executive team member. What I do with my clients is I start by going out and looking for what the stakeholders are asking for. So if you can gather data that shows over half of RFPs are coming in with requests for this information, or clients are asking for it in onboarding, or that your deal velocity is slowing down because you can't provide adequate responses, everybody's going to care about that. So bringing that perspective in. If your investors are at your doorstep asking for this data, your CEO will definitely care about that. For your CFO, oftentimes you can bring in cost savings through efficiencies. CFOs love that. There's also a risk management aspect to the CFO. So talking to them about, okay, what are the material risks that this is triggering for our business and how do we manage those? Then bringing in your CHRO, human resources, they're about the talent pipeline, and employees and prospects are asking about a company's sustainability practices, and they want to know that they're working for a responsible company. So I do think it's important for lawyers to bring in the regulatory piece. I choose, when I'm kind of talking to executive teams and doing trainings, I put all that other stuff first. And then I bring in the regulations, and the role of the regulatory piece and the message when you're building a business case is to show, and this isn't going away. So there is, especially in the US, because we had this situation where the SEC, put out climate disclosure regulations and then immediately stayed its own regulation. There's a kind of this back of the mind sense that maybe this will all just go away. But once you start looking at that global regulatory perspective, it's like, all right, clients, investors, employees, all asking for this, and it's not going to stop. And so that's the key message from a regulatory perspective in again, the US. In the EU, it's nope, we have to do this, and we're going to be subject to huge fines if we don't. So you can lead with regulation in the EU.
What if the objection is different from the C-suite? Maybe instead of the CFO and the CEO being concerned about, hey, look at the headcount we have to allocate to this, and you're telling us we have to go hire a consultant to help us with this, and there's some advice from outside counsel. What if the objection instead is like from the CMO and the CEO saying, okay, I see how this could be good for us, but what if there's backlash to us doing ESG stuff? How do you explain that to those sorts of internal stakeholders?
Yeah, companies choose different forms of communication. There's companies that believe that taking action on ESG topics is key to their brand, and they want to lead with it, and they want to have it on their website, and they want to have, ambitious goals, and it makes sense for who they are. And then there's companies that don't want to lead with it. They don't think that it's
Mm-hmm.
going to resonate with their audiences that are out, looking at their website. But they still have to be able to answer on the back end. They still have to meet investor needs. If a client requests the information, they still have to be able to provide it. And if you look at the numbers, so this is the other thing I love to lead with when I'm talking to executives, it is impacting things like credit ratings. It's impacting things like the cost of borrowing money. So there's all kinds of financial reasons that you may take action even if you're not splashing it on your website. In fact, splashing it on the website has gotten a lot more tricky as greenwashing litigation has increased, and there's more scrutiny on the statements that companies are making.
Is this bubbling up to the board level? I mean, that's kind of an interesting question, maybe. Is the board your ally here, potentially, if you're looking for resources and funding and you want to push ESG programs within a business?
Yeah, well, it should be bubbling up to the board level. I saw a quote from a Harvard Law Review publication that was, ESG is the new frontier of fiduciary duties. What you're seeing, you think about a board's fiduciary duties, and it is all about managing kind of material risks and opportunities for the business. Maybe managing is not the right word. Let's say it's all about overseeing and making sure that the company is appropriately managing material risks and opportunities. And that doesn't just stop at the environmental and social role. As a lot of politicians would like to say, oh, nope, you don't have to manage those material risks if they're related to the environment or social causes. But that it just makes no sense. If it's a material risk to the business, it just is, and so that extends into your fiduciary duties, which means as environmental issues and social issues, they've become tremendously more complex and impactful over the last 2 decades. So boards really have to understand how these impact the company and make sure that there are appropriate procedures related to it. Now, are all boards doing this? Not yet. There is an upskilling that's underway. I do some training through the Boardroom Africa, which is fantastic, that helps board members and future board members upskill on ESG so that they are conversant in these topics. There's similar ESG board training programs around the world. And I've done some individual board trainings where it's like, okay, we're ready to upskill and up-level how we're thinking about this and know what we need to do, whether you're preparing for new disclosures or just thinking about what your risks are. So this is absolutely becoming a key part of fiduciary duties and something that the board should be aware of and monitoring.
You've touched on it a couple of times, and it's this idea that ESG has become, and I mentioned it in my introduction as well, that ESG has become politicized. And we're not on CNN, so I'm not asking for like a deep dissection of what different politicians think. But and then the flip side of this too is you also mentioned sort of greenwashing. It's that some companies aren't really doing much substantively around ESG or sustainability, but are trying to take advantage of what they can say from a marketing perspective. So, I mean, I guess, on the politicization point, like a broad question, like, why do you think that's happened? And then maybe on both sort of topics, what sort of responsibility do you think that C-suite leaders have to change the narrative around ESG or around sustainability? Or is that, I don't know, above their pay grade even?
Yeah. I mean, from a political standpoint, there are kind of philosophical reasons that the Republican Party in the U.S. prefers smaller government. We can go back, more than 100 years about that. And the Republican Party generally wants government to stay out of different issues, including environmental and social issues, as part of the overall philosophy of small government. What that's meant for their political rhetoric is that they've taken this term ESG and
Mm-hmm.
that is very much a business term and come out to their constituencies and made it a political term. So ESG
Mm-hmm.
is really not about government action. It's about what a company is doing. And what a company does is based on the interests of the stakeholders of that company, where
Mm-hmm.
the board and the management team are in the best position to make those decisions. And so it's been a good source of headlines. It's been a good source of kind of getting the base riled up to rail against ESG, because it sounds like you're railing against a larger government and overly controlled approach, and your liberal elite, or however you want to discuss it. But the political conversation really has nothing to do with the actual business, the underlying business reasons that a company would want to move forward on ESG. So it's unfortunate that it's been kind of brought
Mm-hmm.
into that sphere. At least I look at it as unfortunate as an ESG professional,
Yeah.
but that's where we're at today.
I mean, maybe put another way, let's say that companies got worried about this and then rolled back some of what they were doing on ESG. Like, what is the cost? What does that look like?
Yeah. What I've seen, there's companies that have changed how they talk about ESG.
Hmm.
Very few have changed what they're actually doing, because typically what they're
Interesting.
doing was, supported by business fundamentals. Now, there are exceptions to this. There's a tractor company that really just killed everything related to DEI and ESG because
Hmm.
their constituency was not happy about it. I think that they faced some consequences afterwards related to that decision. So there are a few examples where companies just completely backtrack. But typically what happens is maybe the company changes how much or how it talks about it, but it moves forward with
Mm-hmm.
actions it's taking because they made the decision to do that for the benefit of the business.
Can you tell us, as we start to wrap up, and then I've got some fun questions for you too, a little bit about how you help companies on ESG? Like, what do your services look like? What do you offer?
That's a great question. I love that question. All right. So what I do, I start with companies. Usually they're at the beginning of their ESG journey. They're realizing some of these client and investor pressures. They want to take action, but it feels kind of overwhelming, and they don't have the in-house expertise necessarily to sort through it. Now, I'll start by doing just a targeted needs assessment, go through, figure out, okay, what are all your stakeholders looking for? What are your different pressure points? I do a little bit of digging to figure out what is the company actually doing. Usually what I find is companies actually doing a lot more than people realize. It just hasn't been kind of aggregated together. So there's already an underlying narrative before we, take further action that the company can share if it's aware of what's happening. Then
Mm-hmm.
organizing that into, what I call quick wins and strategic items. So there's some quick wins you can always get there. Maybe you're missing a Modern Slavery Act policy or something like that. But,
Mm-hmm.
if you're a U.S. company doing business here, you don't have slavery. So let's just get the policy in place. If you're a broad multinational manufacturing or raw materials firm, it gets more
Mm-hmm.
complicated. But a lot of the companies, there are these little actions you can take where you're just reducing friction with your stakeholders. And then the strategic items are more things that will require a longer term investment. Typically, climate would fall within this. DEI would be something that could fall within this. I'm seeing AI governance. That's a big one that companies need to take on right now. And those need to be brought up to the executive team because you're going to have to engage the company across the board. You're going to have resources, internal resources from different teams, which requires a broader executive support. I'll go and do some executive training and board training on these topics so that executives and boards have the basic picture and understand why this is important and can start building a consensus around it and figuring out how to move forward. And
Mm-hmm.
then if companies want to do some reporting, I won't do a 100-page glossy report. I don't really believe in those for these small companies, but I have something I do called the minimum viable report. And this is, hey, we're just going to strip it down to the information that your stakeholders need and
Mm-hmm.
provide that. And let's provide that, and let's not, go off the deep end in terms of the reporting. And so I try to really help companies strip it down to the material issues, get what's core, focus on those material issues, and make actual progress against them instead of trying to cover everything on the waterfront.
Let's say that I'm in-house, maybe a last sort of like substantive question for you. Let's say I'm in-house and I want to learn more about ESG. I want to start educating myself on this, or I want to advocate to take on some of this work internally. Where should I look outside the business to learn besides your LinkedIn posts?
Yeah.
And how should I make the case to my GC, or maybe I'm the GC to my CEO that like I'm the right person to do this or help do this?
Okay, fantastic question. So for the first one, actually, I have a visual aid. Um, I have this book, ESG Mindset. It's
Excellent.
by Matthew Sokol. He's one of my favorites on LinkedIn. He publishes on ESG all the time, and it's really one of the few books I've seen that's done a fantastic job of tackling this subject. So if you're a reader, get a copy of Matthew's book and start there. You'll learn quite a bit. And then the other thing that I thought was just fantastic, this summer, Nawar Al-Sadi, who publishes quite a bit on LinkedIn. That's NAWARALSAADI. He put together a 9-week series of posts that broke down ESG. And what he did is pulled together the best articles and free resources across 9 different topics. So if you wanted to go on a self-education journey, go back and look at his post, because it is a very excellent, just guided map through what's already out there.
That's great. And let's say that I am in-house and I'm sort of like advocating to my boss to take on some ESG work. Like how have you seen that done well?
Yeah. Typically, if you raise your hand and you're willing to do it in a company, people are happy to let you do it.
Yeah.
So it's there until you ask for budget. And really, when you ask for budget is when the rubber meets the road in terms of action. And what you really have to do in that case, and this is the perfect season right now. We're early October when we're recording this, so this is budget season. You have to build those individual supporters, whether it's your salesperson, your CFO, your CHRO, to bring that ask and to bring that full picture business case. So talking about the clients, the investors, the employees, the different financial impacts of this, so that there is an underlying business case to support why the company should invest in it. So if you are just going to spend 10% of your time working on it, put up your hand and companies will generally let you do it. But once you need those dollars, you have to be a bit more strategic.
Well, this has been a masterclass on ESG. I've got a few fun questions for you now, Christine, that I like to ask our guests. The first one is what your favorite part of your day-to-day is.
Gosh, that's a tough one. So actually, I really like people interactions and really being able to spend time with people. So doing things like this, I do a lot of podcasts. I do a lot of presentations. I do presentations for my clients, and I work in my little virtual office, right? This is where I am at most of the time. But when I get to have those moments of interacting and helping to educate people, that really means a lot to me, which is one of the reasons I said yes when you called me.
And you've got the mic. You're a professional podcaster.
I'm good to go.
Do you have a professional pet peeve?
Oh, I do have a professional pet peeve. Um, so when you're in a large meeting, this would
Uh-huh.
happen to me quite a bit in executive meetings. Sorry for all the executives who worked with me, and the conversation comes down to just two people, and the two people are circling around and circling around and circling
Mm.
around, and it's then 30 minutes later, and it's just has nothing to do with the rest of the meeting. So I really like it in a large group meeting situation when it's, you're keeping the conversation so that it is involving everyone in the room.
Don't waste people's time. That's a
Yeah.
very fair one and good one.
Yeah, that's
Meetings are
much more
expensive
succinct.
too.
Yeah. Much more succinct.
I am a big reader. You've already given us one book recommendation specifically on ESG. So if you want to skip this one, that's cool too. But I'm always looking for book recs for myself and for our audience. Could be something environmental related, or could just be a great book that you've read recently.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a reader too, and not everything I read is on ESG. Usually at the end of the day, I do read some kind of fiction. I hate looking for books.
Uh-huh.
So I found this shortcut. If I read a book, it's either off of the Oprah list or off of the Reese Witherspoon list. That's it. I kind of confine my world to those two, and it's always good. But I recently just read the story of Edgar Sawtelle off of the Oprah list, and it's a story about a mute teenager who's living on a farm in the 1960s with his family, and the family's business is to raise these incredible, amazing companion dogs. And
Mm-hmm.
the dogs in the story kind of take on a little personality and a life of their own, along with of course, coming of age and the story of the family and the setting. So if you follow me, I post weekly on Scooter, my dog. I am a big
Yes.
dog person, and I believe in sharing the love of dogs. So getting this it was a dramatic novel, but having this, the perspective of the dog weaved in there really, really hit home for me.
That's great. I need to read more fiction too. So I like that. Last question for you, Christine, as we wrap up. Something I like to ask all of our guests. It's if you could look back on your days just getting started as a lawyer, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
Yeah. When I think back to my early law firm associate days, the thing that took me a long time to realize was the importance of relationships. So I went into law firm life and I was all about the work production, all about the billable hours, all about having that perfect product, which is, I thought that it was really the key to success. And it is important clearly in that area. But what I learned in law firm life is really the make or break was the relationships that you built. And so having a proactive plan and a proactive approach to building those relationships is critical. And this is why when I was a general counsel, I always had a 90-day plan for every team member that brought on. And then at least half of that plan would be a list of names. And I would tell them, the most important thing in your first 90 days is to go find these people and build a relationship with them. Get on their calendar, set up 30 minutes, go to a function, however you do it. But I'm going to be asking you at the end of the 30 day or 90 days, do you know these people? Because I would pick out folks that I knew would be make or break for the team members.
I love that advice. And I love that tip for managers everywhere. Christine, thank you so much for joining me for this great episode of The Abstract. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.